Hello, welcome to part one of The Art of Ancient Egypt. This is chapter 3, module 3 on Canvas. So let's start by looking at our maps. So I showed you the map of the Fertile Crescent on the right. I showed you that last time when we were looking at Mesopotamia. And today we're moving over to the other side of the Fertile Crescent, and that is the Nile, and looking at the culture that grew up there, which is quite different from that of Mesopotamia. So they were close neighbors, however, so there is contact between them. So just notice by looking at the map on the left that all of the cities are all sort of clustered around the Nile River. I should also say that Upper Nile is in the south and Lower Nile is in the north, which is kind of the opposite of the way we think of up and down in our maps and our directions. So just keep that in mind. Also, with this little inset in the map on the left, here you can see Karnak and Luxor are on the east bank of the Nile, and on the west bank are the tombs. That's also a generalization that holds true for a very long time, is mostly people lived and worked and worshipped on the east side of the Nile, but when they died, the west side took all of the funerary activity. And there's quite a bit of that. We're going to go into that. So probably you already have a concept of Egypt being largely desert and having some fabulous tombs and pyramids and stuff. So we're just going to sort of add on to that. So there were two Egypts, two kingdoms once, an upper and a lower Egypt. And at the beginning of our early dynastic period, we have the king of, I believe, Lower Egypt conquering the king of Upper Egypt. So, oh, sorry, the other way around. The king of Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt, and this piece commemorates this victory. So we're going to look at this in some detail. This is our first piece of figural Egyptian art. It's our first piece of Egyptian art at all. And look at the date here. It's 2950 BCE, which is about 5,000 years ago, and it is contemporary with the Sumerian culture things that we saw last time. So I just want you to always think about a timeline and that things are not sequential. Not all things are sequential, but they're simultaneous. So this is called the Palette of Narmer. And Narmer was the king who conquered Lower Egypt. And this is called a palette because its shape sort of resembles a palette that would have been used by Egyptians to mix up their the black stuff that they put around their eyes. And on the back side of it, or the top side, whatever you want to call it, there's even a little indentation here where the makeup would have been mixed. But this was never used for that. It was a ceremonial piece. So there's quite a bit on here to read. And first of all, let's look at the big guy here, Narmer, that is the king, and his mode of representation shows something very similar to Naram Sin, where from the waist down to the bottom of his feet, he's shown in profile. His chest and his arms are shown frontally. His head is in profile again. Also similar to Naram Sin, we have that same scale issue going on where he is shown defeating his enemy who is shown on a much smaller scale. So this man is down on the ground and he's being hit, apparently struck by Narmer. Down in the bottom here, we even have some carnage. We've got some dead bodies of defeated enemies. And then on a still smaller scale back here, we have what is probably a servant of Narmer. So he's way down the totem pole, and he's carrying a pair of sandals. So if you look at Narmer, he's got bare feet. Other than that, there are lots of symbols. Up here on the top, there are a couple of bull heads. The bull is the symbol of Hathor, who is a deity. Egyptian culture is polytheistic. They have many deities, as you will figure out. I'm not going to require you to remember any but one of them. So just be ready when you see him. And his name, Narmer, is right here in this little cartouche. It's sort of a hieroglyphic symbol that is the signature of the person. Over on the right, we have the reverse of that side, and it's got several different registers, as you can see. Surrounding that little indentation that we saw are two very long-necked animals. Either they're a hybrid giraffe, lion, because the head looks lion, the tail kind of looks like a lion, but the neck is much longer than any lion. And they've got two handlers. These little guys floating up above them are holding leashes that are tied around their necks. So I love the handlers. Down here at the bottom, we have Hathor, again, Hathor's bull, and it looks like Hathor is participating in the conquering of Lower Egypt. Up at the top, we've got a parade, a procession, where I'm assuming this is Narmer again, parading with many people who are not nearly as important as he is. So they're shown really, really tiny. And over here on the right, we have a stack of dead bodies. So this shows, again, symbolically the carnage that he brought on Lower Egypt when he conquered it. So we have bodies without heads. Hope you can see that. But in between their legs, there's a little clump of something that is thought to be their heads. So not only were they killed, but then they were beheaded. So this symbolizes the unification of Egypt and the beginning of the dynastic system, which will run for about 3,000 years. So here's a figure from a tomb painting, and I'm just showing you this now because it echoes what we just saw in Narmer's carved, his relief carving of his body. This is the Egyptian style, to show this composite view, this composite pose of profile, frontal, profile. And look at the eye on this man. It's a frontal eye. So this becomes the symbol for humans. There's a very rigid canon of proportions. So it seems as though every human you ever see will have the same sort of relationship of body parts to body parts. But look at the creatures around him. This is one of the things I love to point out, is that the artist seems to observe nature and is able to copy what he or she sees. So we see some birds that I'm sure could have been identified by species if you were familiar with those birds, which I'm not. So there's a lot of detail to the contour of the bodies, the plumage, that means the feathers on them. This man also has a woman standing behind him who's not nearly as important, and another woman under his legs, not as important. So I'm going to try to give you a real basic introduction to the funerary practices, and that is because most of the art that we have from Egypt was found in tombs, and so we don't have their everyday environment. We don't have their everyday clothing. What we have is what they have left in tombs. So they had a very elaborate funerary practice. And I should also say that during the course of the 3,000 years that they existed, that there were some changes in beliefs. There were some changes in the names of gods and some terminology. And then when you go from the Egyptian language, even the ancient Egyptian language, into modern English, there's going to be some difference in interpretation. So if you're already a fan of Egypt and you know quite a bit and you hear me saying something different, just, it's okay. Just get the big idea, get the big picture. So in Egypt, there was a belief in 4 parts to every human. There were four parts. The Ka, or the spirit, was the one that lived on after death. The Ka was like the soul that we might experience in Western art, you might believe in. And then there's the body. So far you're with me. That's kind of a normal dichotomy of these two levels of existence, a spiritual and a physical existence. But there were two more parts in the Egyptian mythology. And one was the Shu, which is the heart, which I think sort of knows the difference between right and wrong, is the sort of the conscience. And then there's the Ba, which is the energy that unites the body with the Ka in the afterlife. So the belief system, in addition to this elaborate, complex human belief, believes that after death, when the body dies, that everything else continues, and the body, in fact, can continue living in the afterlife. If everything is done exactly right, you can have a long, endless life in the hereafter. You can become one with Osiris, the god of the underworld. So, it says here, the belief that the Ka spirit lived on after every human being died and would require a body to inhabit. To fulfill the requirements of the Ka, Egyptians built statues as substitute bodies and tombs with furnishings. So here's a diagram of the first style of tomb that the Egyptians used. And this is called a Mastaba, and it's in red here because it will be on the quiz, that term. So a Mastaba was a flat-topped, one-story structure with slanted walls erected above an underground burial chamber. They tended to be grouped in a necropolis, which is literally a city of the dead. So what's happened here is the ground has disappeared. You have to imagine this thing is sitting on level ground. And this is the Mastaba, and this is the air shaft that connects the Mastaba with the burial chamber, which is underground. So the reason they have this air shaft is they believe that the Ka could come up, it could join with the body if it chose to, or it could leave the body and come up here and inhabit a statue. It could float around the world. It could go visit its wives or husbands. So there's a lot of flexibility in what the Ka could do once it was freed from the body. But it was important to have that air shaft so that it could actually get out. I know, don't ask. Here's diagrams of the three types of tombs. The top one is the one we just saw, the Mastaba. So it's just another diagram. Inside of it, it's got sort of transparent walls so you can see that there's a chamber where a statue would stand. And I should also say that this is kind of the optimum. Not everybody, certainly not servants or shopkeepers, could probably afford something this elaborate. So we're just really going to be thinking about and talking about what the best funeral arrangement you could have. And that was usually the kings. So in the middle, we have a step pyramid. And look at this diagram because this is what we're going to look at next. It is a mastaba. You can see that there through that transparency with a whole bunch of stuff piled on top of it. So it kind of looks like a ziggurat, but there's no temple on top. It's not a place for worship. It just simply piles a bunch of rock on top of a mastaba. And then at the very bottom, we have one of the great pyramids of Giza, which we will talk about very soon. So here is the step pyramid of King Zoser. He was an Old Kingdom king, and he ruled, and when he died, this was built for him. And it does look like a ziggurat. I think there must be a connection. As you saw on the map, they're not that far from the ancient Near East. It's quite possible one culture saw the other culture and thought this was a very nice looking monument that is certainly going to survive the centuries. So in this, the wall was 34 feet high. There is a courtyard, which you can see on the right. Let's move forward here. So there's that same photograph, but this is a diagram of how it would have looked. So there's a large courtyard over here, and then a smaller one here, which is called the Sed Festival Complex. So in the Old Kingdom, the kings, and I use that term instead of pharaohs just because pharaoh means king and we speak English. So the kings would, once a year, there would be a festival called the Sed Festival, and the king would show his fitness and his ability to rule by running, by like going out and jogging. I don't know exactly what the course was or how much he would jog, but this is what he did because the king was considered divine. He was considered a god, and so really, really fit. And you will see all images of Egyptian kings make him look perfect. So this complex was built for Zoser because they thought that even after his body had died, his Ka would want to continue to run in the Sed every year. So a little fake Sed courtyard was built over here, and that's what this photograph is here. It's the Sed complex. And it was like a racetrack in the middle of buildings, but the buildings were all fake buildings. They were just solid stone. And again, it was thought that his Ka would recognize this as a norm and be comforted by the fact that he was able to get out and run around in the Sed. So very interesting, I think. But really, his body was underneath that step pyramid in a cozy little Mastaba tomb. Then we get to Giza and the Great Pyramids of Giza. So you can see there are 3 of them. You can see the modern city of Giza in the background here. This is an old kingdom, Dynasty 4. 3 large pyramids. The smallest belong to Mankari, the middle to Coffrey, and the oldest and largest to Khufu. Those are 3 of their names, but they also have names that I believe come from Greek, which is Mycerinus, Chephren, and Cheops. And you might see them used interchangeably. The largest one was 450 feet high, and it covered 13 acres at the base. They were all covered with a limestone veneer, and it would have made the apex 30 feet higher. The only limestone veneer that survives is on this one. So that's Coffrey's. And you can see the desert out and around it, so it's very, very dry. So there are only 3 pyramids, but there have been so many kings over 3,000 years. And there's a reason for that. The pyramids were built because before this, the kings, when they had their tombs, they would be buried with their everything they wanted, and it was always the best. There was lots of gold and jewelry and beautiful furnishings, everything a king might desire to have in the afterlife. And within a few years of his burial, his tomb would be robbed, so everything would be missing. And that was, a source of great sadness and stress, I think, to the living kings. So some brilliant engineer decided to create a tomb that was going to be impregnable. Nobody could rob it. And that's the idea of the Great Pyramids. And they have secret passageways, hidden tombs. It was just, you can look at them. If you can't figure out where the door is, it's pretty safe. And then if you got in, where would you go? It just goes on and on. However, it turned out that these 3 tombs were also robbed in very short order. So this new style of impregnable tomb was abandoned. They said, we got to do something else. So they ended up going over into the Valley of the Kings and kind of putting the tombs down under ground level and not leaving anything really obvious on the surface. But they were still robbed. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the funerary practices that the Egyptians had. So here I've got several illustrations. Up in the upper right, we have a diagram of the 3 pyramids at Giza as they might have looked at the time. So each of these pyramids had 2 temples associated with it, a valley temple and a funerary temple. And these 2 temples were connected by a causeway. So right here you can see this is the valley temple, this is the funerary temple, and this is the pyramid. This pyramid over here on the right, in fact, has a lot of mastabas behind it. So it seems like a lot of family or close relatives or perhaps retainers are buried with him, and 3 smaller pyramids out front that probably had wives in it. Anyway, so let me tell you what would happen. And I have some illustrations here from some Egyptian art. So when the person would die, they would die on the east side of the Nile where they lived and where everything was happening, where it's the land of the living. And the body would be put in a cart and carried, dragged down to the banks of the Nile. It would be placed on a boat, on a barge, and carried across the Nile. Then it would get, that's what all these pictures are. Then it would get to the Valley Temple. And while it was in the Valley Temple, this is where most of the physical work of preparation of the body would take place, where the body would be completely dried out or mummified using salts and removal of everything that was moist in it, so including the brain. So they would pull the brain out, I've heard, through the nostrils and throw it away because they didn't realize it had any function and didn't think people would need them in the afterlife. 4 of the organs were given special treatment because they were believed to be very important in the afterlife. And these were the liver, the lungs, the intestines, and the stomach. So these 4 organs were removed from the body. They were treated separately and placed in special jars. So after the completion of the mummification, which would be about a month, then the body was ready to be buried. And so they would put the body on a cart and carry it along the causeway. So apparently this raised sidewalk or road had only one use. It was used only once, and that was when the king's body was carried down here to the funerary temple. Then when the body arrived at the funerary temple, this is where the priests would take over and do everything that they possibly could to make sure that this king would survive into the afterlife. So there were many spells, many magical spells and things that they would do to the body. Then they would wrap the body up with long strips of linen cloth. And as they were wrapping, they would recite these spells. They would take little amulets and place them over parts of the body as they wrapped and said more spells until finally the entire body was wrapped up. And then the final spell was performed, and that was the opening of the mouth, where they would say a spell that would ensure that in the afterlife the body would be able to open its mouth. And this was so that the dead person could talk with the deities in the afterlife and also take in nutrition so that it would continue to live. So these are very important spells in their minds. Over the years, over the 3,000 years, the number of spells and the ceremonies got increasingly elaborate. So there's sort of an evolution. It was also a big business. So the priest made a lot of money from the sales of spells, from the performing of spells. If you could afford it, you'd pay as much as possible to make sure that you didn't die forever. So here's the Sphinx. This is the Sphinx of Coffrey, I believe. And this, I showed him, it's down here. This is the location of the Sphinx by his temple, by his pyramid. So actually, in proportion to the pyramid, it's very tiny, but when you stand right next to it with a camera, it makes it look really huge. So that's it. It was the body of a lion with the head of the king placed on it. Sphinx. Now, we're going to look at some more imagery, some more artwork of particularly kings. So this is Coffrey, again, one of the 3 Great Pyramid kings. And he is seated on a throne, and he is exhibiting everything that a figure of a king should exhibit. I told you, as we saw in Djoser, that he should appear strong and fit and able. There he is sitting there. Look at the muscles on his arms. He looks perfect. He looks placid. He is strong. He is able to rule. Also, the characteristics of a king are that he wears this particular headdress and he has a fake beard. To my knowledge, he's the only Egyptian who has a fake beard. He has nothing on his chest, nothing whatsoever, and he wears a kilt. Legs are bare, no shoes. So he has 3 additions to his very fit body. That is the headdress, the beard, and the kilt. All of the kings are created by a certain canon of proportions, and that canon of proportions is determined by a fist. So he's even holding his fist here to make it very convenient. So for example, well, we use feet, right, as a measurement. They use fists. So they would say from shoulder to shoulder, this is so many fists. From the top of his head to his waist should be so many fists. So once you're making a figure and once you determine the size of the fist, then everything else is just automatic. It's just a matter of formula. And that's the canon of proportions. This is not necessarily a likeness. So it's too idealized. We cannot know at all what Coffrey really looked like. So here's Mankari, another one of the 3. And he is with a woman who is probably his principal wife, Cameronepti II. And I love this picture because it says so much. First of all, look at him. He's wearing those same 3 items that we just saw in Coffrey. He's got the headdress, the fake beard, the kilt, and nothing else. He's also looking very strong. Look at the width of his shoulders, the contours of his chest. Everything is super strong. There's some strange little conventions here, like his knee looks like a little squarish block, and his shin is very angular, like a blade almost. Those are strange things. He's also giving us a nice fist here. Now his wife over next to him has her arm around him, which is a very affectionate gesture, and she's bringing her left hand up and touching his arm. So she's reaching out. She's showing her connection to him, her almost care. But does he even know she's there? I mean, there's no indication in his face, because if he were to tip his head towards her, if he were to turn his head, smile at her, to show in any way that he was aware or that he cared for her, he would stop looking like a king. And the important thing is he must always look king-like. So you get these 2 showing this, demonstrating this. Another thing I find very interesting about this couple is that there's no hierarchic scale. They seem to be on the same scale, which is unusual and kind of progressive. So I think it's very, very nice. I'd like to know, I'd like to be there when they made that decision to make that artwork. Now, by contrast, here's a fellow who is not a king. He is a scribe. And look at his body. It's not the same canon of proportions at all. He doesn't have to look king-like. He's sitting cross-legged. He's writing. He's holding something that he would have been writing on, and originally there would have been some writing implemented in his hand, but it's gone. He's also been polychromed, which means he's been colored to look as naturalistic as possible. So this was found near a tomb. So was it buried? Was it meant to accompany its owner into the afterlife? Quite possibly. Look at his tummy, his little sagging gut. It's great. So here's some more tomb art. So even though tombs were robbed and all the grave goods removed from them, and who knows whatever happened to them, the things that were not stolen were the walls of the tomb. So whatever was painted there or sculpted remained. And so you get things like this. We get more tomb art than we do grave goods. This is T watching the hippopotamus hunt. So what we see in the tomb art in general is representations of life, where it's thought that these were placed in the tomb to sort of comfort the dead person, to remind them of the things that they loved in life. So here's T. Look at his depiction. He's got the profile from the waist down, his frontal, his profile head. But the people in the boat hunting the hippos are much smaller than him. And down here in the water, we've got hippos and fish swimming around. These parallel lines are thought to represent the reeds along the bank of the Nile, and then up above, across the top, we've got some foliage and some animals in the trees and some birds. So it's just kind of a nature scene, a hunting scene. Now here are some of the symbols of ancient Egypt that you may have seen before. So on the left is a white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt. Once the two Egypts were combined, the two crowns were combined. This eye is the eye of Horus, also known as a Wedget. And then a falcon is the god Horus himself. The Ankh there is a symbol of life, and the scarab, I believe, is the symbol of the afterlife. There's a seated Horus there with all kinds of symbols on him. And on the right, another one of our treasures from the library on campus is an Egyptian plaque with Isis and Osiris. And up at the very top, I think you can see an Ankh. You can see a Wedget here, a Wedget there. And this is Osiris seated on a throne. More than that, I cannot say. It's not very large, but it's very, very interesting. So you should go see that if you can get into the library. And here is another symbol, the winged scarab. So this is also in the UNCC library. Now we get to the Middle Kingdom. So this is a there was an intermediate period, and then there's the Middle Kingdom. So the intermediate period was chaotic, and then stability was restored under Mentuhotep's 12th dynasty. This is the only piece from Middle Kingdom we're going to see, Senusret III. It's a royal portrait. A lot of people interpret this different sort of look, this appearance of this king, to indicate that he's a little more stressed than our earlier ones. He's not showing quite that calm perfection. like he's got little wrinkles between his eyebrows. He also has really big ears sticking out. But anyway, you don't need to worry about Middle Kingdom. Oh, sorry, I had this one also from Middle Kingdom. So this is some more tomb art, and it shows the dead person here in the center of these three being welcomed probably by dead relatives into the afterlife. There's a table full of food here that is an offering. There's hieroglyphic writing up here. So as you look at hieroglyphics, you can start to recognize little shapes. So unlike the cuneiform, which has been so abbreviated, we don't see anything recognizable in it. You can recognize things in the Egyptians, like you can see birds and other animals in there. Like way over here on the right is a bird. So anyway, there you go. Now we're moving to the New Kingdom, and this is, so I should say, for 3,000 years, things didn't change very much. In the New Kingdom, the Egyptian political control over territory did expand, so they spread out a little bit more in northern Egypt, mostly along the coast, not so much in the desert. And there were a couple of aberrations. And we're going to look at those just because they're different. So, like I said, for 3,000 years, the style of artwork, the tombs, the likenesses of the kings really didn't change very much. But in the New Kingdom, there were two times when they did change. So the first change is Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut was a woman. So she was the daughter of Thutmose I. She married her brother, Thutmose II, but he died. And when he died, she became the regent for Thutmose III, who was the son of Thutmose II by a concubine. So she was not the mother, but she was sort of the aunt slash stepmother of Thutmose III. So he was too young to rule. So she declared herself king. She became the regent, which means the person who rules in the place of an underage or incapable monarch. And she declared herself king. So she has likenesses of herself made as the king. So this is a woman, and this is how different it gets. So you can kind of see that she has breasts, that her body is a little bit more contoured than a male king, but she's got the headdress, the fake beard, and the kilt, and nothing else. So there's the kneeling figure of Hatshepsut. More figures of her. So it's also believed that after her death, there was an attempt to sort of erase this embarrassing chapter from the history of Egypt. And so there was a lot of destruction of images of her. So almost everything we have of her looks pretty damaged. Anyway, there you go. Two more of her. I'm sure this one had a beard, but it's missing. You can also see the breasts under the headdress there, just sort of hinted at. She's not going too far out and saying, oh, I'm such a girl, but it's hinted at. But this is what she's really known for. So she designed her own funerary temple. And just to remind you, this was where all of the spells took place, where her mummified body would have been brought, and the priest would have performed many, many spells and wrapped her body with amulets and performed the opening of the mouth here. So I think it's really an impressive monument. If you look at it, it's up against this rock face out in the valley of the Kings, I believe, in Deir el-Bahari. And it's got several levels, several terraces with these long ramps and a central axis. This long line of approaching the temples goes right up the ramp with these colonnades on either side, but still up, 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 and then you get up here, and there are several little temples. So I'll show you some of the diagrams of it. Here's the close-up of the end. So there's the colonnade. That just means a group of columns. And this is the central causeway, the ramp that goes up. And then the upper platform court, and then many chambers here, and they're kind of all labeled as to which deity they were dedicated to. So there's a lot of Hathor here, a funerary chapel over here, so you can see all of that. Now, I'm not sure, but I did read somewhere that originally these terraces would have had gardens in them, and pools of water and gardens, which, considering the environment, would just be really labor intensive to maintain if that were true. And here's another diagram showing, again, Hatshepsut's down here with the causeway, the ramps, and the colonnades leading up here to these temples. But the Funerary Temple of Mentuhotep III next door was not too different from it, so they're kind of similar. But this is not where the bodies were buried again. So they were buried in a secret place, and that was just simply where the spells were said. So this is the end of part 1 of chapter 3. Stay tuned to find out what happens next.